right, everyone. So this week, we're making a major transition. We are leaving the legendary world of the creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel, and we're really entering, in some sense, history. I say it in quotations because we really don't know how much of this is history and how much traditions carried on. It's very hard to discuss the historicity of things. It's worth noting that some of the things that are mentioned here really go back to antiquity. A little bit of, I'll mention it as we go along, but there are things here that have to date from a very early time because of the way the society is being described, which is different from how it would be later on, even as late as the time of Moses. So we're dealing with very ancient traditions. And remember, there were 10 generations before the flood, and now 10 generations have followed the flood, and we are at the onset of really a new period. We're going to be picking up with chapter 12, verse 1. If you have Eitz Chaim, it's on page 69, 12:1. And I'm going to look very carefully at the first sentence, actually, the first pasuk. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, and God said to Avram. Right? So this is the first time that God has spoken to anybody since Noah. Right? It really comes out of nowhere, in a sense. And God tells him, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoludecha mibeit aviha el ha'aretz asher alech. Go forth from your native land, your father's house, and go to the place that I will show you. Why Abraham? The text is absolutely silent on this fact, and it's noteworthy. Because remember, 10 generations earlier, the last time God spoke to someone was Noah. And the text went out of its way to tell us he was Ish, Tzaddik, Tamim, a righteous man in his generation, and so on. You had a sense why this was the person. Here, nothing. So the Jewish tradition, and in a number of ways, going back to the Midrash, looking at Maimonides, says it isn't that God discovers Abram, but Abram discovers God. That he becomes aware of the divine. In a polytheistic culture, he comes to believe in the only true God. And there are stories about this. Probably the one you know is the most widely known. In fact, it's so widely known that people think it's in the Torah, but it isn't. This midrash about how Abram's father, Terach, was an idol maker. And one day he went off to a fair or something to buy new idols, left Abraham in charge of the shop. A woman came in with some flour. She asked Abraham to give it to one of the gods when he was there. Sylvia, please mute.
Yeah,
Here, I'll do it for you. Okay, so give the flour to one of the idols. Abraham smashes the idols. He's the first iconoclast, literally an idol smasher. And he takes this hammer, which he used, and he puts it in the hand of the biggest idol. And his father comes back and he sees all of his merchandise destroyed. And he says, what happened? And Abram says, well, this woman came in with some flour and she said, give it to one of the idols. And they were fighting over who would get it, right? And the big one just, ended the discussion. And his father says, well, they can't hear. What are you talking about? And Abraham says, well, if they can't hear, why do you worship them? Right? There's this sense that and there are other stories also about how Abraham starts to worship the sun and the moon, and he realizes that something had to have made them, and he turns his attention to the fact there must be a being, a creator, who has created everything. Maimonides, those are rabbinic midrashim. Maimonides later on, who sees Abraham as a philosopher who deduces the existence of God through reason. Any way you look at it, these rabbinic figures attempt to explain that which seems in terms of the text inexplicable. Why should God have singled this person out? And as we'll see, in a very generous kind of way. So he says, God said to him, leave your native land. It's not actually his native land, but it is the land where he is living, right? Because he had originally come from Ur. His father was on the way to Canaan. They stopped in Haran, and that's where God comes to now to speak to him. It's interesting that we have first your native land and then your father's house, because you would assume that you leave your father's house first and then you leave your native land. The rabbis read this, I think quite rightly, as saying that it's more difficult. So each thing that Abraham is being asked to do is more difficult. Leaving your native land is one thing. Leaving your family is something else. And he says to him, go to this land that I will show you. It's unspecified at this point. You'll know when you get there, something like that, or I'll tell you when you get there, unclear. It's going to turn out, though, that Abraham, the iconoclast, who is setting it all behind him, is actually going to be going to the land that his father had originally set out to go to, the land of Canaan. I think sometimes as much as we can rebel against our parents, we sometimes find that we're just continuing their own journeys. At any rate, Abraham here is told, and he's given this fantastic blessing. God says to him, Escha l'goy gadol, I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Right? So very, very dramatic. You'll be great, renowned, lots of progeny, lots of descendants, and you will be a blessing, so that I will curse those who curse you, and I will bless the ones who bless you, curse those who curse you, and the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. Either you'll be a blessing to them, right, or they'll invoke your name. May you be like Abram when they bless other people, or Abram's God, may Abram's God bless you. All those kinds of things. The last we heard from God, he was really cursing. He's cursing the earth. He was cursing Adam and Eve. And here it's very much more optimistic, right? These words of blessing. And this idea that the human race will be blessed through Abraham. I can only read this in the context of what came before, which was God's enormous disappointment with human beings that God had created. So much so that when God looked at them and saw their evil ways, God destroyed the world, flooded. It seems now that God has another way of going about it, and that is work with one family. I'll pick one person, one family. I will bless them, and through them and through their influence, the world will come to be blessed. So it's a different strategy, I think, that God is invoking here. And what does Abraham say? He says nothing. He just says, Vayelech Avram ka'asher diber alav Adonai. He just went as God told him to do. So this is Abraham, who is the faithful servant of God. Let's remember, he's 75 years old, right? And now we're in the world where age actually matters, right? Not people who are living 400, 500 years, right? He's 75 years old, and he's being told, leave everything behind. Go out into the wilderness. You'll see when you get there, right? So this remarkable response, without a question, without an argument, I think tells us a lot about Abraham. One of the things that we're interested in seeing here is what kind of person is Abraham that God would have chosen him? You could ask the same question later on about Moses, as the things that Moses do reveal his character. So for one, Abraham is loyal. He's trusting, he believes in God, and he doesn't question God. And he's 75 years old. And who goes with him, right? V'yikach Avram, he takes Sarai Ishto, his wife, ve'et Lot ben Achiv, and his nephew Lot, the son of his brother. So the family, he has no children, but he does have this nephew. Remember that Lot's father, who was Abraham's father's brother, had died. And presumably now Abraham has kind of adopted him as a member of the family. He's brought the nephew in because the nephew is fatherless. And not only do they go, but they take everything that they have, all of their wealth, such as it was. In other words, this is not just going off. They are leaving everything, taking anything they had, and they are going. And then we get this odd statement, right? His wife, his nephew, all that they had, and ve'et hanefesh asher asu b'charan, and the souls that it says that they had acquired, the persons that they had acquired, but the Hebrew is et asher asu, that they had made. So the rabbis read this. One obvious way to read this is slaves, right? And that, I think that's informing the translation in the Jewish Publication Society when it says acquired. But another way to read this, and this is the way the rabbis read it, is that these were converts. That Abraham really represented a completely new way of looking at God, and that and they want to emphasize, he and his wife have drawn these people in. So that he is the first person to encourage, foster conversion to Judaism. And he will leave with his followers. I'm reminded this is not at all the same thing. There was in New York City for years, when I was young, a very influential Rabbi Riskin. You may have heard of him. He was at the Lincoln Square Synagogue. And at one point, Rabbi Riskin made Aliyah. And I don't know, a third of his congregants went with him. He represented a certain kind. They established a community in Efrat, and a yeshiva, and so on, right? So this idea that Abraham's people, those he had led to God, would go with him also makes a lot of sense, I think, and that he and his wife were actively involved in this enterprise. This shows, by the way, I think, a very positive attitude towards conversion. And I think you see in biblical times and even early rabbinic times a very positive attitude towards conversion. It changes. And there is a thread of tradition to discourage converts, to send them away, not to accept them. Probably comes about during periods of persecution when it was very dangerous to bring someone into the Jewish people. Those stories of the martyrs, we read them on Yom Kippur about how these rabbis who apparently were making converts, some of them were martyred by the Romans. And in fact, in the Talmud, there's this remarkable statement which says that when someone comes to you, you should say to them, don't you know that the Jewish people is a despised people? And the convert says, the potential convert says, I know and I'm not worthy. Which I think means I know that I'm putting you in danger because you are part of this despised people. I'm not really worthy of this sacrifice. Nonetheless, I'm here. So Abram either is the first person to make proselytes, and that would be, if you think about it, if God's plan is now to work with one family to bring about, tikkun olam, the fixing of the world, then you would expect that family to draw adherence to them. That's part of the process, really, of what God intends. At any rate, so they go, and they arrive in the land of Canaan. And Abraham passes through the land as far as Shechem, which is at the terebinth of Moreh. All right, I'll talk about that in a minute. And the Canaanites were in the land. So first of all, Shechem, where Abraham is going to build an altar, is one of a series of places where later on, after the conquest of the land under Joshua, there will be temples built and God will be worshipped. Eventually, all of that gets centralized in Jerusalem. But before that, we have these different cultic sites around the land. And one of the things we see Abraham doing is, in a sense, establishing those sites. The idea that he comes to a place, he builds an altar, and that later on, that place will be a place where a temple, small t, is built, I think is quite striking. The terebinth of Moreh is a lone, it's a tree. It's a very large tree, one which is known about, probably a very old tree. I'm reminded of it, and Moreh is like teaching or wisdom. It's hard to know exactly what this is. It's true the Canaanites worshipped tree. They had cultic trees. Maybe it had something to do with that, although Abraham certainly wasn't worshiping the tree. I'm struck by the fact that Deborah, the prophetess, the judge, was described as sitting beneath the tree, Tamar Devorah, Deborah's tree. Deborah's actually her date palm, right? So these trees have a great deal of significance here, but this is just giving us a location. This is where Abraham settles, and then we get this very striking statement. The Canaanites were in the land. Now, what's striking about this statement, and it's raised first by Ibn Ezra, the great medieval commentator, is that at the time of Moses, we say that Moses receives the Torah on Sinai, and these are the words in the Torah. Well, the Canaanites are in the land in Moses' time, right? I mean, so why would we say in those days there were Canaanites in the land? It seems to suggest, unlike now. And so Ibn Ezra says, there is in this a great secret, and one who understands should be silent. Really noteworthy phrase, because I think Evan Ezra realizes that this statement undercuts the idea that the whole Torah is revealed to Moses at Sinai. Now, of course, we've talked about this a lot. We've looked at different traditions that seem to contradict each other. But why this is significant to me is it goes all the way back to the medieval period. This awareness that there's something problematic about the idea that the Torah, as we have it, was given to Moses at Sinai, not a series of laws, which is clear, but the whole Torah. And the rabbis deal with that elsewhere as well. At any rate, it's simply one word, as they were then in the land. And now God appears to Abram. He's arrived, and God appears to him. It doesn't necessarily mean that he saw God. This verb, let me put my glasses on. Yeah, okay. Vayera, right? God appeared is used elsewhere where it's simply auditory. There's no sense it's necessarily a visible image of God. I would say God made God's presence known, might be another way to translate it. And he says to Abram, now that he's in the land, right, to your offspring, I'm going to read it in the Hebrew syntax, Lizaracha, to your offspring, I give this land. Right? I want to read it that way because Abraham doesn't really get the land, right? He's going to have to leave. He's going to come back, right? And we're going to get, when we get to chapter 14, where God makes this covenant with Abraham, God will say explicitly, right? Your descendants will be strangers in a land not theirs, and I will bring them back, and then this land will be their possessions. So it's to your descendants that I'm giving this land, and Abraham there builds an altar to God who had appeared to him. And then, so that's all we know about what happened there. God made that promise. Abraham built the altar. And then he goes to Beit El and pitch his tent there, and which was to the west, with Beit El on the west and Ai on the east. And he builds another altar to God and invokes God by name, right? Beit El is another one of these places where later on there will be a temple, right? And now he's going in stages. He's working his way through the land towards the Negev. And something happens, and we're up to verse 10 now. Actually, before we get that, let me just give you a chance. Any questions up to this point? Anything at all? Go ahead, Barry. Unmute.
So one question that occurred to me is how did it seems to
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding you.
Yeah, how did polytheism develop?
Right. So that's a good question. The Bible is silent on the question. Maimonides attempts to understand it, a very long treatise that he has. There's a section of the Mishnah Torah, which is his grade code, and there's a section about idolatry and how one deals with idolaters and can one do business with idolaters and a whole host of other things. And he describes it in a very naturalistic way that people, lost their connection to God, that they saw these lights in the heavens and other things, and they began to worship them. The Torah itself is unclear. It just, from the time of Noah, Adam and Eve, these individuals knew God. They didn't worship other gods. But here we're in a different world. a world much more like ours. And I think that's one of the things that I want to emphasize in this transition from that earlier period to now of something that feels a lot more like history. Anything else?
Yeah,
Yes,
so well, just one thing
sure.
that occurred to me is that at the Tower of Babel, the people were punished and scattered, and it may be an unintended consequence of that people had their own language and developed their own customs and ended
Yes,
up worshiping their own God.
that's very nice. I like that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Sandy.
Just two quick things. One is it's Shlomo Riskin. Is that who you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, he's on Jewish JBS, Jewish Broadcasting, on TV. From
Nice.
time to time, I see him. Okay, and the other is it's interesting that I don't know. I don't see anything about Abraham's brother Nahor mentioned.
He died. That's all we know.
Haran. Oh, Ron.
I'm
He
sorry.
had two brothers.
Yes. So, right. So the
They
answer,
mentioned that Haran died.
yes.
I don't remember Nahor also.
Yeah, all right. It's a good point, and I don't know the answer to it. Yeah, no, but because I was wrong. Right. So Lot is the son of Haran. Not,
Yes.
if you go back to chapter 11, verse verse 31, right? Terach took Abram and Lot ben Haran ben Bano, right? So Lot is the son of Haran. Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
No, that's not. But I wasn't correcting. I was saying Nahor. He has another brother, Nahor, and I don't see anything about him as far as leaving.
Yeah. Right. So he's not, whereas Lot is essentially a member of his household, right? He's this fatherless nephew. Haran is not a member of the house, right? So he doesn't take Terach with him either, right? His father's going to continue living. He's not going, right? Abraham is breaking away. Abraham is taking, you could call it his nuclear family, right? Because Lot is a kind of adopted son in some ways. But the rest of the mishpacha, that's essentially that's what it says, right? Leave your father's house. So they're all being left behind. Okay, let me pick up where I left off. Hold on, just want to. Okay, so we get to verse 10, right? We're still in chapter 12. What we're going to see now is an episode in which Abraham and his family go into Egypt and come out again. And one of the things I want to emphasize about this, and I'll point to it a couple of times, but there's a very close parallel here between what happens to Abraham and his family and what happens to the Jewish people later on. Abraham and his family will go into Egypt because of a famine. There will be plagues, and he'll come out with great wealth. The exact same thing will happen later on. The Jewish people, in the time of Jacob, Joseph, go into Egypt because of a famine. They're enslaved there, plagues, come out with great wealth. There's a rabbinic principle, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, that the doings of the ancestors become a symbol for their children. In other words, this is enacting, in some sense, on a micro level, what will happen later on a macro level. But one thing that's striking about this is, it just says, V'hirav ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. And therefore, V'yered Avram Mitzrayim. So Abram went to Egypt. God just told him, it's going to be great. It's your land. Wonderful. And Abraham's been this trusting person. So he gets there, and God reaffirms that. And then he can't survive there. There's a famine, and like in later times, when there's a famine, people go to Egypt. Because Canaan, right, is completely dependent on rainfall. And if there's a drought, there's a famine. Egypt has the Nile, and the Nile, therefore, is very fertile and will be able to sustain people even during periods of famine. Now, it can get so extreme that that's not true. And we see that ultimately in the time of Joseph. But for a while, at least, that famine lasted years and years, right? So here, Abraham is forced to go into the land, and now we get from my perspective, one of the most problematic stories we have about Abraham, right? He's about to enter the land, and he talks to Sarai. This is the first thing we hear Abraham say in this narrative. God said, go, he goes, God blesses him, he says nothing. Here he's going into the land, and he speaks. What does he say? I know you are a beautiful woman. Very nice. Every woman wants to hear from her husband, I suppose, that she is a beautiful woman. I would emphasize she's 65 years old. Right? Later on, when Sarah dies, the rabbis are emphasizing that she retains her beauty until she's 100 years old, right? It's really quite extraordinary to say that a 65-year-old woman is so desirable, but he says, I know how beautiful you are. The Egyptians will see you and think she is his wife, and they'll kill me, and they will let you live, right? So they're going to want you because you are that beautiful. And think about how precarious Abraham's position is. God said, I'll be with you, I'll promise you, I'll protect you, etc. And Abraham is terrified. He has no choice but to go into Egypt. And so what he says to her is, say that you're my sister, so it will go well with me because of you, and that I can remain alive because of you. And what does she say? Nothing. I want to emphasize the fact she says nothing. Later on, we're going to read about her relationship with Hagar, and I want to come back to that at that point. But here, she acquiesces. Now, she is related to him. We see this in a later story, like a half-sister. However, right, he is saying, they're going to take you. Right? And presumably Pharaoh, or whoever takes her, we don't know that it's Pharaoh, will have his way with her. One of my teachers years ago said, which I thought was rather crass, Abraham pimps out his wife. I don't like that idea here because he's a man in desperate straits. The rabbis criticize him for this, and commentators criticize him for this. They said he should have had more faith in God that he does this. He showed himself to be a man of faith, but here, facing really the loss of his life, he does it. I do think there will be consequences for him later. I'll come back to that. And one of the things, actually, one of the modern critics suggest, which I think is interesting, is she says that she is his sister. That means that somebody who wants her will have to negotiate with him, right? That they can't just take her Now, it turns out it's going to be Pharaoh, so there's not going to be any negotiations, right? What Pharaoh wants, Pharaoh gets. But one way of understanding this and seeing Abraham in a slightly more positive light is to say that he's going to stall this off. He's going to enter into negotiations. Maybe things will get better in the land. Maybe they'll be able to leave. However you look at it, though, it's not his finest moment. Okay, so Pharaoh's courtiers praise her to Pharaoh. She's taken into Pharaoh's palace. And because of her, and it's interesting, right? It doesn't say Pharaoh. Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's palace. It says the woman. Right? She's sort of lost her identity here. She's just the woman, that woman, taken into Pharaoh's palace. And it went well for Abram, just like he thought. And he gets sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, camels. And camel is not domesticated until relatively later. It doesn't become widespread, but there's some evidence that there were some camels early on, and obviously a sign of great wealth to have a camel. They're not, at any rate, Abraham makes out like a bandit in this deal. But here we get it. We're at verse 17. But God afflicts Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues, nigaim gedolim, and on account of Sarai, the wife of Abram. And he must know. Pharaoh must either figure it out, or he says to Sarai, what, this is what's changed, right? He's gotten this woman. Did he get to sleep with her first? And then the plagues come? The rabbis are very quick to say, no, no, no. In fact, one of the plagues was that he was rendered impotent. He couldn't do anything, right? Because, it's not what we want to think about. And she certainly remains barren for a very long time. So we're not worried about her being the father, Pharaoh being the father of the Jewish nation. At any rate, Pharaoh sends to Abram and he says, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her as my wife. And then he says,
Buenas tardes.
Valech. Take and go, right? Like he can't wait to get rid of Abram, and they send him off. Pharaoh puts people in charge of him. He gives him retainers, presumably to make sure he gets out, right? They speed him out of the land, but he takes with him Sarai and all that he possesses. So what's the outcome here? Just to reiterate what I said earlier, this foreshadows the Exodus. We have going in a time of famine, being taken captive, plagues, leaving with great wealth. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a minute here. Let's see what time it is. Yeah, okay. Give me a second. Questions, comments before we see Abraham the warrior? Andy, go ahead.
Abraham's assumption that if they assume that if Sarah is his wife, that he will be killed, I find surprising in the sense that wasn't polygamy then? I mean, didn't they have lots of wives, especially the pharaohs?
Yes. Yes.
So why would they kill him? They just take her as another wife.
Pharaoh can have more than one wife, but if she's Abraham's wife, then it's adultery.
So does Pharaoh care?
I'm sorry?
So what for Pharaoh? Does he care?
That's the assumption. The assumption is that Pharaoh may or may not care about that. And maybe we go back to the other assumption and that this is an attempt to stall. It's a bargaining kind of chip. That if somebody wants her, they'll have to negotiate. Unclear. But I think later on we have a similar story. This story appears in different forms several times. And in one of them, he says, I didn't know that there was people feared God here, that they had a sense of morality. That's why I did this. I assumed they would kill me. At any rate, for whatever reason, Abram feels that if she's his wife, they will kill him. That's his read of the circumstance. Anything else before we go on? Yes, go ahead, Janet.
God is controlling the situation, and since God is inflicted the plague on the Pharaoh.
I'm sorry?
No, so God inflicts the plague on the Pharaoh. So God has a presence in the story.
God has a what in the story?
A presence.
Yes, absolutely. Abraham's lack of faith, if we can call it that, was unwarranted. Right? God in fact will protect them, him.
So one way to view this is God working towards fulfilling his promise.
Yes, I think so.
That Abraham comes out survives the famine and comes out even wealthier than before.
Yes, I think God is working to fulfill the promise. What's troubling here is that Abraham doesn't seem to trust it. Otherwise he wouldn't even use this stratagem. Janice, I saw a hand. If you do, you have to unmute. No, you're still muted. Here, you know what? Maybe I can unmute you. Let's see. No, I can't. Oh, yeah. If you know how to unmute. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Let me see if I can do something else. Just stay there for a second. I want to go to, where is it? Yeah, here we are. And let's do.
If you go to participants, you might be able to unmute her.
I'm looking at that. It says I have to ask. It doesn't, I don't.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay. I was going to ask you, it says Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues. What were the plagues?
Good question. So it's unspecified. Unlike in Exodus, where we really do get a sense of what the plagues are, here it's completely unspecified. And that's one of the things that gives the interpreters, rabbinic interpreters, an opportunity to say, well, actually, he became impotent, or there are other. It doesn't seem to be relevant. There are not a lot of details in this story. It's just the barest sort of details. Later on, of course, in Egypt, we're going to have 10 plagues. We're going to know all about them, every single one of them. Here, it's just in some ways a foreshadowing.
And also, can we compare the story of them leaving to what's going on today with the war and everything to people leaving their land and things like that? Because I don't know if you can compare it to what's going on today.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, what you have here, and it's true in the time of Joseph also. Well, in this case, we're talking about economic refugees, right? Mm-hmm. They're not fleeing war, but if you think about, for example, huge numbers of people who have come to the southern border in the United States, there's a really good parallel, I think, to this situation.
But I was thinking about more in terms of Israel, also in terms of like the Palestinians being, they've lost a lot of their property and land and things like that, and the Israelis certainly with the war October 7, how they were all had to just relocate and everything. So what's going on in Israel, I thought you can compare it as well.
Right? You can, in the sense of people being forced to leave.
Right, forced.
But I think that it's important to note that they're not being displaced by war.
Right. Okay.
So I'm going to have to, I have a little more time. There's the local clergy association is having an event, and I said I would participate. So I'll have to leave just about 5 minutes early. Let me get a little bit more into it. And now we get to chapter 13. Chapter 14 rather. Well, before that, we have this. Okay, so he goes from Egypt, chapter 13, with his wife, all he possessed, together with Lot. And Avram kaved ma'od. Literally, he was very heavy, but the idea is that he's very rich. He has a great deal, and in cattle, silver, and gold. And he works his way back up through the Negev to Beit El, where he had been before, between Beit El and Ai, the site of the altar. And then again, he invokes God's name. Presumably, in this time also in Thanksgiving, having escaped. However, Lot also, who had gone with Abraham, and he also has flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support them together. For their possessions were so great they could not remain together. So the problem is that they are nomadic pasturers, right? That's what they do. They have sheep and goats and flocks, and they travel around in order to feed their animals. And at a certain point, the land is not able to sustain them. And more than that, they also need water. And there's only a certain amount of available water. So, and there is quarreling, it says in verse 7, right? There is a reeve, or a dispute, or a quarrel between Abram's shepherds or herdsmen and those of Lot. And then again, we get this, the Canaanites were in the land. And it says, and Abram said to Lot, let's not fight. Let there not be anything between us, because we are brothers, achim anachnu, we're kinsmen. The whole land is before you. Let it separate. If you go north, I will go south. If you go south, I will go north. So Abraham here is being remarkably generous, right? I mean, he's the adopted father, right? I mean, Abraham is the one who, in some ways, is responsible for Lot's wealth and for the fact that he has so much. But Abram says, you decide. So this sets up a question, which is, first of all, it tells us something about Abram's character, right? This generosity. It also tells us something about Lot, because what will he decide? And we'll see. So Lot looks and he says, he sees how watered the plain of the Jordan is, all of it. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, all the way to Zoar, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So he looks down to the Jordan Valley, the Rift, right? The Rift Valley. And he sees it as an incredibly fertile place. And not just up in the north towards the Kinneret, but all the way down to what we would now call the Dead Sea, right? And we know that it's extremely arid and dry around the Dead Sea, but this was before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, something we'll read about in a few weeks. And so it's all incredibly fertile. It's got, Jordan is like the Nile, it's just irrigating everything. And so Lot chooses the best, chooses for himself the plain of the Jordan, and he goes east and they depart. And Abraham remains in Canaan. Lot settles in the cities of the plain, pitching his tents near Sodom. The inhabitants of Sodom, very wicked sinners against the Lord. So he moves into a very bad neighborhood. And it must have been known. We get this sense of not only is he taking the best for himself, but actually, he's not a person of highest moral character either, if he's willing to go and live in this place. Which is going to make it all the more striking next week when we'll see that Lot is taken captive and Abram is going to bring in the cavalry and go and save him. But we'll have more about that. And God says to Abram, after Lot had departed, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. I give you the land you see, to you and your offspring forever. And here we get it to repeat it again. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. So if you can count, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. In other words, they will be uncountable. There'll be so many of them. And then he says, get up, walk the land through its length and breadth. I give it to you. And Abraham moves his tent and he comes to dwell in Mamre, which is in Hebron, and he builds an altar there. This idea of walking around the land is in antiquity and the ancient Near East. This is how you take possession of something. You can take possession of movable property. Someone gives it to you, you receive it. But to take possession of land, you literally have to walk the land. And that is what God is telling Abram to do here. Not only, go look around, but take formal possession. This is mine. I who created it all. This is mine. I'm giving it to you. We need an act of acquisition, and that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to open it up. Let's see how much time I have. I've got like 2 minutes. Go ahead, Francesca.
So does this mean that in lieu of a contract, which is God's gift,
Yes.
that's the contract, is him saying that?
It's interesting, how does God sign a contract? Presumably, God's word is good. But actually, I'm glad you said it, because probably next week, if not the week after, I would almost certainly say next week, we are going to see God actually signing a contract.
Really? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to miss it. We're going to Egypt on Sunday for 2 weeks.
But what could be more appropriate?
Yes.
Even though there's no famine here, we
No.
wish you a good trip. Give the
Thank
pyramid
you.
regards.
See you in Shul on Saturday if you happen to be there.
And I look forward to seeing the rest of you next week. And I think, you get Wi-Fi in Egypt, of course, you can look at.
Okay, we'll see. We might be on the Nile at that point on a cruise. We'll see.
Come back with great wealth.
Yes, thank you.